Hey everyone, welcome back to another session of Where Do We Go From Here? It's Imran Khan again, call me Imi. And I'm really excited today to have a very good friend of mine joining me who is one of the people who I look up to most, a friend here in Berlin. His name is Michael Scaturro. Michael's a freelance journalist who's done work for The Atlantic, that's actually been quoted by the US Congress and even Stephen Colbert. He was previously a staff reporter at Bloomberg covering Brexit, trade, and technology, and now he's focusing a bit more on food policy. And he recently wrote this amazing article about chicken. So if you like chicken, you should definitely read this article. I'm going to actually link some of Michael's work below so you can get a chance to take a look. But incredibly inspiring person, someone that I'm really grateful to count among one of my friends. So welcome, Michael. How are you?
Hi, Emmy. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much for joining me today in this conversation. So, Michael, you know that I started this series because I'm really keen on starting to explore what's happening in the world right now, right? Given the current crisis, and I'm particularly keen on thinking about the lens of young people, right? So my nieces, right? They're the people who really inspired me to do this project and think about, well, what's the world that they're going to inherit? Like, where do we go from here, right? So one of the things that I'm really, really interested to talk to you about is what you think is going to be the impact of all of what's going on journalism, right? Kind of from two perspectives, right? People who are getting into the field of journalism, right? Young people who are starting out as journalists, but then also young people who are consuming content and consuming information. I'm really curious to get your perspective. What's been the impact of the current crisis on that?
Well, I would say that in terms of the labor market, people at large, papers like the New York Times and FT and places like that are working harder than ever.
Mm-hmm.
But freelancers are seeing a lot of their work dry up, and that's been a concern for a lot of people who do freelance work. I think what I've noticed is that the major, what we call the GAFA companies, but especially Facebook, Google, Twitter, continue to allow state-sponsored propaganda and fake news, misinformation from the United States administration to spread unabated on its networks. I know that some sites have placed like a link below information that's just patently false, like learn more about COVID-19 under these ads that might say, sunlight will cure COVID-19, so completely false information. But they don't really take any of those things down, right? So they're just basically dodging that responsibility because they say that they're not publications, they say that they're portals, right? And there's a body of legal work that from the 90s that basically protects that stance. I don't think it's morally defensible, but that's what they say they have the right to do, basically. So I think they have an inherent conflict of interest because obviously what they want to do is stoke outrage so that people click more. And by leaving these kinds of these fake articles, this propaganda from state-sponsored actors on their websites, they really are just essentially benefiting in a business sense from more outrage. And when they do make these sort of announcements about doing something, I think it amounts to window dressing, unfortunately. And all of it makes it harder for journalists to do their work, right? Because when you're constantly battling against hundreds of articles that are or thousands in some cases of articles that are completely wrong, complete lies, journalists have to go back and fact check all of that, and we lose a lot of time because we have to try to look at all the stuff that's out there, even the stuff that's completely wrong, and we end up wasting a lot of our time looking at stuff that's just wrong,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately.
And do you think this is something that's like it's been exacerbated in the last few years? It's something that you feel has really, really come into stark contrast because of the COVID crisis? Like, because one of the things that I find really difficult is there's so much information. Like, who's supposed to police the information? Like, what kind of guidelines do we put on that? Is there like a responsible mechanism within the field of journalism that has existed for that potentially could be used here and that isn't being used? Like, I'm really curious to get your thought on like this impact. Is it something that's more recent, or has this been creeping into our society for the last few years?
Well, I would say just to start that this is not something that has started during this crisis. There have been numerous instances of portals like Google, Facebook, Twitter, allowing their sites to be used by state-sponsored actors, like I'm thinking China, Russia,
Hmm.
Iran in some cases, which basically just post propaganda, and they allow that to stay up. We know that Russia Today, which is a Russian government propaganda TV network, is one of the largest video content providers on YouTube. And I
Hmm.
think it is very problematic that these American companies profit off of the selling of outrage, right? The selling of incorrect information, because people are just all too willing to believe those things. And I would say journalists are actually doing a great job. We have more journalists. We have more journalism than ever, but we have fewer journalists doing that journalism and working under more budget pressure than ever. And yet, I think there are still great stories coming out. And I don't think journalism is the problem at all, actually. I think it's the fact that journalism is fighting against large, rapacious American companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, who basically have scooped up all the local advertising markets, right, which used to help prop up small newspapers, and replaced it with essentially content that is completely spurious, which of course is more interesting for people to click on. People of course, want to read about fake things that's more exciting than the local town building a bridge or something. But there's been a vacuum now because there's just not enough local news in a lot of communities.
You
And
know,
it's a shame because, go ahead.
please no, finish your thought. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And it's a shame because these companies really are shirking their civic responsibility. Companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter should be putting money into a trust and sponsoring the creation of local news. They should be subsidizing it at this point. And that was a major point in the PEN America report about how to save journalism. This is what they should be doing, but they're too greedy and they have no sense of responsibility to society. So they would rather basically promote fake, spurious content that generates outrage, generates more clicks, and is ultimately better for their bottom line.
You know what's
And they're doing it all around the world, so not just in the US.
what I find interesting about that is I think you know I kind of understand your frustration with this, right? As a journalist, like I can understand totally your frustration with how there's a slippery slope of pushing this whole world into a more dangerous, kind of way of getting people to consume content. I think one of the things that I've noticed as just a consumer of information, right? I have sources that I consider to be my reputable sources that I go to. Even the headlines and some of those reputable sources, sometimes I find now to be more sensationalized, because then when I read the content, then I'm like, oh well, the headline is very misleading. So I'll give you an example. Recently with the COVID crisis in Berlin and Germany, there was a lot of talk about how the R naught number is going up, and there's been a 2 or 3 time fold increase in the number of reported cases since there's been an easing of the lockdown. And when I actually read the article, it was really interesting because it was like, yeah, the cases are going up. The cases are tied to, the R naught numbers are really tied to infections that happened, a week or two ago, right? So like the rate of infection from a week or two ago, and also that as long as the number stays between a certain window, that's okay. It's just a matter of if it goes, let's say 1.9 or 2.0 and stays there for 3 weeks, then it's a big issue. And so it's so interesting. So the headline felt like it was saying, oh my God, easing of restrictions is going to like end the world. But then when you read the article, it actually wasn't saying that at all. Do you see any of that happening from even reputable sources? Like, I'm curious to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there's always in a crisis situation, and with a virus that's as new as this, there's always an issue, maybe it's even like an issue of journalists not understanding what they're reporting on, or feeling like there's just not enough information. So they might write a headline that is what they think could be correct, but is is ultimately misleading. That does happen. I don't think the major news sources do it though. I think the New York Times of the world, FT, the print papers, let's say, have been diligent in trying to create a balance between generating healthy interest and maybe skepticism about not wearing a mask and things like that, and generating outright outrage. I would say though that if you look at some of the reporting around AIDS, HIV/AIDS in the early '80s when it came
Mm-hmm.
out, it was also very sensationalist. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the thinking was that you could get it if you went to a public bathroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the government actually, and journalists, serious journalists as well, had to really work to create understanding around how HIV/AIDS was actually spread, which is just through blood and semen, right? Not
Mhm.
through any other saliva or things you can get in a public place. So the when there was more known about the virus, people could report more of what they knew, right? I think right now we're at the very beginning of this. I mean, you might as well think of this as like 1982 with HIV/AIDS, right? We don't know
Mhm.
very much about this virus, and we've only lived with it really for in this sort of iteration of the virus. We've had coronaviruses for a long time, but this virus, as it is now, is really only like 6 months old, and
Right.
the whole world is trying to figure out what it is and how it works. So I'm willing to give a lot of serious journalists a pass because they're struggling to get the story right, and
Right.
there's a lot of information that they have to dig through. So I don't think it's ill intentioned. The headlines might be
Yeah, that's actually really good
slightly
context.
inflammatory.
Yeah, yeah, that actually helps. Like, just help someone like me, right? That's just a consumer of media to better understand, where a journalist coming from and like what's the responsibility on their side. Actually, I think this is a good segue into the second thing that I often ask folks is, so now we kind of understand, there's an onus here on, as you've articulated, an onus on portals like Facebook's, Google's, et cetera, and then talking a little bit about, journalists and them trying to figure out what's the right and what's the right information and reporting it in a way that's reasonable. um what do you think are going to be some of the short-term and long-term consequences out of what's going on now? Like, do you think there are going to be, you know how is journalism going to change? Like, what do you think are going to be some of the immediate results of this, and then the long-term results of this?
I have a sense that the this bend towards experts and science, this idea that we really do have to listen to science and experts, is actually going to be a positive thing for journalism,
Hmm.
because people will want real information. They won't want the Fox News garbage propaganda news that they get from Fox News. They'll want the real news that they get from the New York Times, the FT, Bloomberg, sources like that.
Hmm.
And I think what the struggle will be to make that equitable, because we know that there's always going to be information and there's always going to be demand for credible information. There have been people looking for news, looking for information in the way that we see it today is like, in written report style reports for the last 500 years. So there'll always be that need. I think what will be a struggle is to see if people who aren't at the top will be able to afford it, pay for it, because I guess the economic crisis will affect what people can reasonably spend money on. And
Hmm.
I guess unfortunately, a lot of people have been given the message that information is free, journalism is free, so they can just pick it up on their phone or watch it somewhere, and it's just there for them. And that hasn't really been a model that works. You really can't finance investigative journalism for free with just
Hmm.
ads around it. That doesn't work. That model was disproven in the last 20 years. So
Hmm.
the struggle is going to be getting people to feel like they have to pay for it. People pay for Netflix, right? Why shouldn't they pay for a newspaper? And I think it's really a question about our democracy. There'll always be information, whether even in situations where there weren't democracies, people could figure out what was going on because people needed to know. When you think of Russia, I think of China. 50 years ago, people were still buying natural resources from those countries, so investors had to know what was going on. So reporters didn't always have access, but investors used informal channels to figure out like what was going on with those marketplaces,
Hmm.
and governments in some cases use intelligence services to bring that information into the investor sector. So there'll always be information. People will always want it, but whether the public, the voting public, cares enough, I hope they do, because in this case, it really depends. Information really depends on, or credible information can really save their lives.
Yeah, and I think this is such a good segue into the last question that I always ask, right? Like, where do we go from here? Like, if you were a young person today, right, either getting into journalism or consuming content, like, what's the advice you would give around how we could start to fix some of these things that you've identified as potential issues, and stopgaps from where we want to be, right? Which would be, I mean, and where do you think we should be, right? That's I guess part of this question.
If I were a young journalist going into it today, what advice would I give myself? Is that the question?
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's twofold, right? It's not only what advice would you give to young journalists, but what advice would you give to young people when they're consuming content, right? Like, how would you, like, what are the things that you would do? Like, if you wanted to parse information that you want to say is credible, not credible, like, what are the lenses that you would give those people, right? So it's twofold. One for young journalists, and then two for young people consuming information.
Well, when I talk to young people in the United States and in Europe, I feel like the answer I hear in both places is, well, if you ask them, where do you get your information? A lot of them will say, oh, YouTube,
Mhm.
or Instagram. But YouTube is kind of a format where people get a lot of information.
Mhm.
And there is a lot of good information on YouTube. A lot of the major news outlets like New York Times, the FT, Bloomberg, BBC do put lots of content online that's freely available. So I don't think there's any excuse to be ill-informed in this day and age, because there is so much credible information from credible news sources that you can consume for free. So if you're young and you can't afford to pay for something, then it doesn't really give you a check. You can't get checked out of being responsible. You can still consume responsible media. So I would say look for those brand names, look for those credible names that you may have seen once on paper or heard used to be printed, because those are the sources that are going to give you accurate information to be an informed voter, an informed citizen. And I
Mhm.
would say when you see these sort of sketchy websites with documentaries that have inside information and will give you the truth that everyone else is trying to keep from you because they're a conspiracy, I'd look skeptically on that, because that is just almost what we were talking about earlier, a mechanism to get you to click and watch it, right? I
Right.
know that there is definitely a place in this world for whistleblowers, and I think we do need people like whistleblowers and people who are willing to, I would say, come out of the corporate world and talk about what they do. Because I think in this world, most of the stuff, most of the most information stuff, interesting information is coming out of corporations, and a lot of people sign
Mhm.
NDAs, like they can't really talk about what they've done. But that's, I think, there's room for whistleblowers in that world, but by and large, I think you're going to find the information that you need to be a credible to be credible in a conversation with your friends and family, and to be an informed voter from the credible news sources, the brand names that you probably have already heard of.
Great. And then also, what about for just young journalists? Any advice for young journalists about how to anticipate what this is going to look like for you in the next, 3, 5, 10 years?
Well, as a young journalist myself, I would say the I think it's a career that you could take anywhere you want. It really depends on what you want. I think that's a question that people don't ask themselves until they're a lot older, until they're maybe in the middle of their careers. But if at the beginning of your career you think this is what I want to do, you should do it, because there is still space for people who want to do great work, who want to do serious work. There's always room for people to do high quality work, even in a shrinking profession. This is a shrinking profession, but if you can, if you have something to say, and if you are willing to go find the stories and to be honorable and to have a sense of honor and a sense of the need to protect democracy, then there's always room for someone like that in journalism.
Great. This has been great, Michael. I really appreciate your thoughts. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me a bit about, what some of the pitfalls you see about the current situation and what we should be anticipating for the coming years, and particularly giving some of your advice. I think it'll be really helpful for folks, especially young people who are looking for the right news sources or, endeavoring in this career path that will help them, right? To think about where do I want to put my time and energy? So I appreciate that. I'm really grateful. And again, everyone, if you want to take a look at Michael's work, a lot of information is linked below. So appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Amy.